What's up everyone? In this video, we will dive deeper into the influence of breathing on the body and the mind. And so by the end of the video, you should be better able to understand why breathing is relevant to manage and optimize your performance and well-being. And so breathing and emotions. When we covered the feelings section, we did not specifically address the structures involved in emotions. And the source of human emotions is specifically in the brain, and even more specifically than that, in some brain structures such as the amygdala. And so what we know is that the experience of emotions causes widespread responses through the entire body. So every emotion is accompanied by some physiological changes. So that's where the sensations come in. So there's a close association between emotions, the autonomic nervous system that we looked at earlier in the previous video, the fight or flight response and the rest and digest response, and breathing. So there's a close association between these three components. And actually, it's more of a complex feedback loop between each of these components, which means your emotions will influence your autonomic system activity. So is it going to be the fight or flight or the rest and digest response? And it will also influence your breathing, like we've seen. So if you're in the fight or flight response, your breathing should increase to give you more oxygen and to send blood to the muscles if you're trying to run away from something. So there's this feedback loop between these three components. So that means that if you're changing your breathing, for example, you can probably modulate your autonomic nervous system, which will probably influence how you experience emotions. So this is something to keep in mind in this video. So the importance of breathing comes from this feedback loop or association between these three components. So like I've just mentioned, breathing can modulate the physiological experience of emotions by changing your autonomic nervous system, so maybe going from a sympathetic activation to a parasympathetic response, and by also modulating or changing your physiological activation. So typically when we physiologically feel activated, when we feel this emotional tension in our body, then we associate this with a difficult emotion like anger or fear, or what people would call a negative emotion. So by changing the physiological experience for an emotion, how it feels in your body, how you interpret those sensations, you basically change the valence of that emotion. So is it helpful? Is the emotion helpful or harmful? But if you change the physiological activation and your autonomic nervous system activation, that will influence how you perceive and understand emotion. So fear or anger, which are typically perceived to be harmful to your performance, right? Well, actually, they can be perceived as helpful, or at the very least neutral, when you have the ability to manage the physiological activation that is associated with the emotion. So without the physiological activation or the emotional tension, you can reframe your understanding or the value that you have for an emotion. So it becomes much easier to welcome emotions when they are not associated with high physiological activation, with high emotional tension. So it's much easier to welcome anger or fear when you don't necessarily have the high emotional tension that comes with the emotion. So picture yourself in a calm and relaxed state with a controlled breathing cycle of deep breaths. When a situation arises where anger is experienced, for example, if you're in that state of calm and relaxed, your body and your mind is ready to welcome the emotion, to experience the emotion, and to react accordingly. On the other hand, when in a heightened state of physiological activation, you might feel this urge or this need to act impulsively because of the accumulation of emotional tension, the pent-up tension in your body. And so the more activated you are, the more you feel the need to react to your emotions, leading to less than optimal responses. All right, so what becomes clear is that individuals possess the ability to alter emotional state using the voluntary control of breathing. And that's huge. Like, think about it for a second. You have the ability to alter or modulate your emotional states, how you feel, by using something as simple as your ability to breathe. And it's one of the oldest and arguably most efficient treatments for excessive stress. Take that in for a second. One of the oldest and arguably most efficient treatments for excessive stress is controlled breathing. I'd say that's a science that's been lost over the years in the West, and it's slowly rising back up. And actually, there's plenty of research trying to understand how these complex mechanisms interact with each other. However, it can be quite difficult to draw direct correlation between them. And even in the past 10 years, and based on the readings that I've done, there seems to be some hypothesis or assumptions for those studies on breathing, but it's not more than just assumptions, hypothesis, or proposition for what might be going on in our brain, in our mind, in our body at the same time. So let me actually give you some of those assumptions so that we can actually use them as principles or rules to try to practice breathing and understand how breathing might influence your performance. So assumptions, what we think we know or might know about negative mood states, so feeling of stress, anxiety, depression, is that they cause a sympathetic activation. This is your fight or flight response. So these sympathetic activation, they can be counteracted by different forms of meditation, relaxation and breathing techniques. So that's why we're talking about this here, this relationship between breathing and emotions. And similarly, what we think we know is that deep breathing and meditation lead to a parasympathetic activation, the rest and digest. And so it leads to a parasympathetic activation, but also an inhibition of the physical sensations of the difficult emotion, like I've said earlier. So the inhibition of the fight or flight response. So like I've said earlier, when you have a difficult emotion like anger or fear, if you're using something like deep breathing or if you've been meditating, that helps with a parasympathetic activation and the inhibition of physical sensations of the difficult emotion. So what's great about this is that you can actually experience fear and anger in a more relaxed or calm state. Another assumption that is made based on research is that a shift from sympathetic to parasympathetic dominance, so a shift towards a rest and digest or a more calm and relaxed state, helps with the inhibition of brain structures like the amygdala and with the excitability of the heart. And so these two components, the amygdala and the heart, they actually act as pacemakers. So what are pacemakers? They are pacemakers of your emotional experience. So in a stressful situation, the amygdala is activated and your heart beats faster. So these are two pacemakers that tells your body and your mind there's a danger, there's something that requires your attention, so you get into that fight or flight mode. However, when you shift to a parasympathetic dominance, you basically become less sensitive to shifts in your current situation. So think about when you experience bad beats, downswings, running bad or coolers. if you're in a more parasympathetic state, you will get a lower activation of the amygdala and a lower increase in heart rate. So two signals that would normally indicate danger or stress are less activated when you're in a parasympathetic state. So your ability to shift from a sympathetic to parasympathetic state will help with reducing the sensitivity of your amygdala and the excitability of the heart. And one last point, a regular practice of slow breathing exercise for something like 3 months improves the autonomic functions of your body. So here's an interesting caveat. Slow breathing or controlled breathing does not necessarily minimize the sympathetic activity, so your ability to fight or flight. So slow breathing or controlled breathing does not minimize your ability to get into a fight or flight response. However, it helps with achieving an optimal balance in autonomic function. So an optimal balance in your autonomic function. So what that means is that it enhances your reactivity to physical and mental stress. By enhance, we don't mean increase, but actually optimize or give you better reactivity and more appropriate responses and reactions. So let's say, for example, you've been accumulating a lot of stressful or difficult emotions in the past couple days, weeks, or even months. You've been on a downswing for a year, and so you feel this pressure, you feel the fear, maybe some anger also. So you're probably living in a state of sympathetic activation. You're probably living more in a state of fight or flight. And so what I'm telling you here is that if you've practiced slow breathing and coming back to a parasympathetic dominance, your current situation will feel less difficult physically and mentally because you have this ability to bring a better balance. So it doesn't mean that you will stop feeling your emotions, but it means that you will be less reactive in a situation where in the past, getting a bad beat would have created a lot of anger and emotional tension. So think about this for a second. If you've been in a downswing for 6 months or a year, you're in a difficult spot or situation in your life, the next time you get a bad beat, you will probably overreact maybe, or feel this anger increasing. But if you've been winning for a year and you get bad beat once, you probably don't have the same reaction. So this is where your ability to cultivate your parasympathetic nervous system will help decrease the amount of reactivity that you have in those difficult spots. Hopefully that was clear. So I've been practicing deep breathing and meditation for the past 2 years, and it really helped with that last point around improving autonomic functions. And from my personal experience, it's not that I stop feeling my emotions. Emotions are still there. It's more that I am less reactive to them, like I've said. So I have more clarity and space to make better decisions. So it's more that I'm less reactive to my emotions, and I have more clarity and space to make better decisions. I still feel my emotions. So keep that in mind. We still want to have emotional reactions because they give us we still want to have some emotions because they give us a lot of information about what's going on in our environment. However, we want to, or I guess I want to be better able to understand, adapt, and react to my emotional experience. So here I'm providing you a tool that will allow you to be less reactive to your difficult emotions or to your stressful situations. I'm giving you a tool that will allow you to feel and experience your situation without acting or reacting impulsively or in a harmful way. And so I guess to summarize or finalize this, what I know or what I knew and learned about the mental game of poker in the past is that you can use logic and affirmations to manage your emotions, right? Everyone's familiar with something like injecting logic or using an affirmation to refocus whenever you feel anger, fear, disgust, sadness. You want to use some affirmation or logic to kind of refocus yourself. However, when you use a tool like this, when you use affirmation or injecting logic, it only takes care of one component of the emotional reaction, your mind, right? Your brain. So you try to rationalize your situation, but what about the emotional reaction related to your body? In those situations when you feel anger, fear, disgust, etc., your body still remains in that activated state when you experience a stressful situation. So how can we manage the physiological reactions from an emotion? That's where breathing comes in, right? So to summarize all the information of the past slides, this is how I would simply kind of summarize it. So first, you can manage your physical activation using the breath to match your desired state of activation and performance. So like I've said in the past slides or past videos, you can use your breath to manage your physical activation to match how activated you want to perform at your best. So it might help you get into your optimal zone of performance, and it will help you to manage the emotional tension that might arise when performing. And so that first part was actually what I feel is missing in the mental game in the mental game environment or culture, is that this idea that we want to also be able to manage the physical activation, not just manage the brain or the mind activation from an emotion. And so physical activation first, and then you can also manage the activation of important brain structures associated with emotional processing. So here we're talking about something like the amygdala. We're actually able to manage the activation of a brain structure that would typically signal that there's a danger. But here we're able to modulate it so that we know that there's a danger, but the activation might be less high, which means a better ability to react in those situations. So by using breathing technique here, we are able to manage or to modulate these brain structures to be less reactive to stressful situations. So we're more available to feel those stressful situations, and we're also able to make clearer and more rational decisions at the table. So if there's something that you want to remind yourself about breathing, this would be it. This is what it all comes down to. So remember these three things, because this is the why behind breathing, or the why behind this is the reason why I'm spending so much time talking about breathing, because I've heard so many times, how do you accept or learn to live with anger or fear? And actually, it's not about dodging or avoiding those emotions, but it's about welcoming them and creating an environment where it feels safe or easy to accept and welcome those emotions. And the way to create that environment is to use breathing techniques to set up your mind and your body to be in an optimal zone to experience your situation. So that's it for this video, everyone, and see you in the next one. So take care.